Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the show. It's Monday, the 8th of February, and this is episode 106 of the Meet the Farmers podcast. I'm your host, Ben Eagle. I've got a farmer focus session for you today, which we're going to dive straight into. Last week, I spoke to Wiltshire-based mixed farmer David Butler.
It's Farmer Focus.
Hello, everybody. This evening, I am speaking to Wiltshire-based mixed farmer David Butler. Yes, it's time for Farmer Focus. David farms 710 hectares with the business consisting of dairy, arable, beef, HLS, contract farming, and property lets. David, welcome to the show. And that's just a short list, but as anyone involved in farming will know, each of those takes up a lot of time, and there's a lot to do with all of them. And then also you have family life and everything else as well. So I'm really looking forward to this. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Let's start about talking about your part of the world first of all. What's going on there with you in Wiltshire?
Okay. So I've always lived in Wiltshire. I'm very fond of the county, as you'd expect. It is my home, and it's a landlocked county, and we're supposed to be in the southwest. I think we should have our own category called the Central South.
Yeah, I've often thought that.
Yeah, because we're kind of, I feel we're not kind of as southwest as like Dorset or Devon or Cornwall. We don't feel that southwest, but we're certainly not southeast. So we're categorised as southwest, and that's fine. It's a special county in terms of what it's famous for. Obviously, everyone thinks of Stonehenge. Most people have driven past that on the 303, if nothing else.
Crawled past it.
It is symbolic of the enormous amount of history here, and there's a lot of pre-Roman history all over the county, across the tops of the hills in particular. So it's also famous for Avebury, which I'm a bit closer to, and that's got some fantastic Neolithic sites.
Let's go back to the beginning. We're not going to go back that far, but let's go back to the beginning of you, your childhood. What kind of kid were you, and did anyone particularly influence you in your early life?
First of all, obviously, I was one of three, so I've got my two sisters.
Okay.
They're both younger than me. So Kate was closest to me in age. She's a couple of years younger than me. We kind of grew up together. But actually, beyond that, I was probably quite a quiet, quite a nervous child. I think it's fair to say I wasn't very boisterous, and so outside of the family, I probably kept to myself. I kept to myself a bit. So it's one of the consequences of living on a farm, quite isolated. It wasn't in a settlement, and it was out, even we're a mile out from the village. So often I did have to amuse myself quite a lot, out and about on the farm. But obviously I had my immediate family. But I was probably quite a quiet, timid child, I think, in some respects. But from a very early age, I really had developed a passion for farming. I loved farming. There was a story as a toddler, when I was very young. We actually didn't live at the farm. We lived a mile down the road, but there was cattle in the fields outside where we lived. And there was one time when it was suddenly apparent I wasn't in the house. I was only just been toddling, got toddling age, and I walked off and got into the middle of this field of cows. Mum and Dad had this kind of dilemma: what are we going to do? Because he's only like 2, and obviously pretty upset probably that I walked off.
Yeah,
got out into these cows. So there was
slightly stressed.
There was this big circle of cows, and so they kind of came up very carefully and quietly, so I didn't get trampled. And then I just kind of made a kind of loud noise and waved my arms, and the cows parted, and out I toddled, and I was okay. But I seemed completely unfazed by being surrounded by these cows.
Very early Stockman instinct.
Yeah. And so I had the instinct to look after cows and live to tell the tale. But in terms of an influencer a bit later on in life, obviously, the biggest influence in my life has obviously been my family, and in particular my father, who is just an inspiration, and my farming oracle really in so many ways. I'm very lucky to have him with me, farming, and mum as well, in a partnership. But outside of my immediate family, I'd have to kind of think of this amazing character we have on the farm called Darky. Well, that was what everyone knew him as, and he was one of the farm team, and he actually started off in Germany in the Second World War, and he was on as a German, he was on a boat in the Mediterranean which was sunk. So he was captured and he was a prisoner of war. And after the war ended, some of these people were reallocated onto farms. And I often think how tough that must have been when you were 17 or 18, didn't really know English, in another country, in the country that you'd been at war with, to then be put on a farm and work there. But he stayed on the farm his entire life. So he worked with 3 generations of my family, with my grandfather,
Wow.
with my father, and he was there for quite a bit of my life, and he always called me boy. But his main roles on the farm was to work with the turkeys. We had a lot of turkeys back then.
Right. Okay.
And I enjoyed working with him on that. He kind of tried to teach me to drive a tractor, which didn't go terribly well the first day. It ended with a bit of a crash. Live to tell the tale. But he just told me to get on with it, and so I had to go, and it didn't end well. But also the other thing that he was very good at doing was he dried all the crops in our very ancient grain dryer at the time, which was a bit of a death trap. But I was always quite fascinated by this very noisy, loud kind of smoking equipment, and so I often shadowed him to kind of learn what on earth was going on, and again survive somehow. And actually, ever since, I've always done the kind of grain drying on the farm and the storage side. So, yeah, this extraordinary character. He was had such a strong work ethic, and he was very good with the livestock and everything else. So he was quite a big influence outside of obviously the huge influence of my family. And then Darky was this kind of slightly Wurzel Gummidge. But slightly old school, but just an amazing character on the farm.
And you went to Reading, and
Yes.
then Cirencester. Tell me about your student times.
Sure. So even from an early age, I always said I'm going to be a farmer. It bored everyone, I think. But at school, I was always known as the farmer. There was never any question I'd do anything else. At school, I had quite a few of the teachers kind of would take me to one side and really try and persuade me to do something else. I won't like it. Really need to think about another career, but I wouldn't be swayed. So then after school, I did manage to get a place at Reading University to do agriculture, and overall 3 very happy years where I met I guess the best friends of my life, really. Yeah. I liked the university scale. I liked the fact there were people from all walks of life, yep. Which was a good thing. I like the fact that actually I lived in Reading as a town, of course not a city. Reading as a town, so I lived in Reading, the centre of Reading, which was a bit of an eye opener, but a good thing for me to do. And it was, the first time really I'd been properly, I guess, away from the farm in that sense, and living independently with a bunch of students in a student house and everything. It was a good education there. It was quite broad. It wasn't specifically just for farming, and it was more perhaps for professional careers, like agricultural support for nutritionalists, yep. and advisors, rather than kind of a hands-on course like you get at college. But it was 3 happy years at Reading, which I very much enjoyed, and I then wasn't still happy to then rush back to the farm, so I found an excuse to do one year of a postgrad course at Cirencester, okay. Which was advanced farm management, which was much more practical and closer tied to what I probably needed to do. It was more honed to what my future career really. So that year went quite fast. So again, I met some interesting people there. There was a lot of case studies and a lot of going on to farm, and so I found that helpful too. So yeah, that was my educational years, right back in between 93 and 97, a long time ago.
And perhaps actually focusing on your farm then, during those years, what did the business look like then? What was going on?
Dad was always a tour de force. So even though I was away, he was always driving the farm forward. Back in the early days, we actually had 2 dairies. So he had we had more milking cows back then than we have now. We had about 300 milking cows over 2 units. But the arable acreage would be considerably less than what we would do now. So when I came back at that stage, my father was starting to do quite a lot of work with the NFU. So when I finished university and finished college, it was around the time Dad was doing quite a lot with the cereals side of the NFU.
Yep.
It worked quite well that when I came back, I could we weren't kind of treading on each other's toes.
Yep.
And so it was not, and he kind of needed my help really a little bit, because obviously with him away, it was useful to have me back and keeping an eye on things. So yeah, back then, it wasn't a million miles different to how things are now, in terms of we were a mixed farm with arable enterprises and arable crops and a dairy. So in that sense, we haven't kind of transformed and changed the sectors we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, let's bring us right up to date and talk at me, because you've got, by its very nature, a mixed farm is quite a diverse business. Can you just talk listeners through the various enterprises first of all, just to give an idea of that diversity?
Yeah. Well, our business structure is not that unusual these days, but to step back, we have two businesses. So we have a family partnership, which has 4 partners: my parents, myself, and my wife.
Yep.
And then we also have a contracting company, limited company as well, and that's has directors. It's just me and father.
Yep.
So it's kind of like two businesses that are physically separate, and the contracting company then does the contracting both for the home farms and for some other local farmers as well. But so that there's a physical separation. So that the family partnership has the dairy, and it has the arable businesses, but the operations are done by the contracting company.
Okay.
And in terms of other enterprises, by having the dairy, we also have beef calves that come through as well. And I mentioned the chalk downland. I mentioned it in Wiltshire. We have quite a lot of chalk downland on our farm, so we need to have quite a few beef animals to actually graze that chalk downland through the year. So where we are now, we have a dairy that has about 280 milking cows. We're on a line contract with the supermarket, and that's become really, really probably, I think, the most important part of our business actually now.
Okay.
Beyond that, as I say, with the arable side, we're growing the traditional crops you'd expect. So we're doing wheat, barley, oats, oilseed rape, and this year the oilseed rape all worked. So I was thinking we were going to have to kind of throw in the towel on oilseed rape, but then suddenly we pulled a year this autumn where it's all grown, and spring beans. But I would say that with quite a lot of the arable crops, we're trying to grow crops at a premium. So we're trying to grow milling wheat. We also grow quite a lot of seed crops for some seed companies as well. So we're growing seed wheat, and obviously with the spring barley, it's malting barley. So we're trying to attract premiums where we can on the arable crops. Dad always describes it with our business that we like to think of it as like a 3-legged stool. So which hopefully makes us a bit more resilient. So you have the arable enterprises, arable crops, the dairy enterprise, but then the third side of the stool is some property lets, which sounds exciting. It's not huge number, it's about 6 properties, but that's a nice bit of income that comes in, that actually, how to put it, well, it's reliable. So obviously it gets some bad weather, it shouldn't affect the income of the property lets, and fortunately it hasn't been holiday lets, so there hasn't been an issue with the pandemic or anything.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point generally, actually, in terms of, I quite like that analogy of those 3 legs, because and it's a question I ask quite a lot mixed farmers, is if one of those legs were to be removed, how would it affect you?
Yeah, well, the arable and the dairy are very much integrate together, as you'd understand. So they do rely on each other. In terms of, I haven't talked about our soil types. So I mentioned that Wiltshire has a lot of chalk downland, of which we've got some, but where we actually farm is in the Vale of Pewsey, and that's like a vein of green sand. It's a really fertile soil type, but it's one you can get wrong. And when I say get wrong, if you let the organic matter go too low, it can erode, it can wash. And it's not good news for me. I'm much more conscious of it these days. It's not good news. It's not good news for my bottom line. But also, as we have the River Avon that runs through the middle of the valley, which is a world-renowned chalk stream, we have to be responsible on that front, and we don't want to see unnecessary erosion if it's going to pass on into the Avon. So the point about that is that we use quite a high return of farmyard manure from the livestock side, and it keeps our organic matter levels up on our soil, and then holds it all together better. So the two on the home farm, certainly the two core enterprises of the dairy and the arable, just really all work well together in that sense.
Before we started recording, we were talking a bit about your team. So I was introducing
Yes.
your team. And I mean, across all these various enterprises, how do you manage your time? And who else is involved? How are you managing everything together?
Well, I never seem to stop. It's a busy life, but actually, if I say that we've got 6 members of staff, then people will probably think, well, what's his problem? We've got 6 members of staff, then it shouldn't be too bad. But there's no one at the management level other than me and fathers to start with.
And there's a lot to do as well.
There's a lot to do. So in my case, I'm doing all the spraying operations and across all the contract farming and our own farming. That's a lot of work through the year. But obviously, team management is really important. Roughly speaking, we have 3 members of the team on the livestock side, for the dairy and the beef, and then we have 3 people on the team of the arable. So that's how we get 6. But and obviously there's also some intermixing in terms of roles as well. So the people on the arable side of the business are pretty glad at the moment to have some livestock work to do, because we're not doing a lot of field work. But it's another benefit of mixed farming that my arable team, I said I've got a newish team and there's some new people, and they've been on a few weeks. And Daniel has not been here many weeks. Said, "Gosh, you're a busy farm," he said. And I said, "Well, you haven't got going yet, Daniel. It's the middle of winter." He said, "I can't believe how busy you are and how much there is to do." And I said, "Well, yeah, it is a bit like that, but that is mixed farming. There's always more repairs and livestock is never ending." But it's a side issue. But actually, at the moment, it's been with the pandemic, with so much else going on. It's been great to actually be able to rely on focus of the farm to kind of distract from some of the horrible things that have been going on, really.
You're clearly very close with your family. But you do have a very busy life. How do you manage to spend as much time as possible with the family as well?
Well, obviously at the moment we're all homeschooling, so I'm very lucky to have a wonderful wife, Catherine, who's through in the other room at the moment, and she's been admittedly doing the lion's share of the homeschooling. But I'm also lucky to have Catherine as someone who's become really passionate about the dairy as well. And so she's sharing a lot of the management work with me, and she does the calves most weekends, and actually the calves this morning. So she's doing a lot of work with the calves, which she really enjoys. And I'm just lucky to have her really kind of developing an interest and a passion for the dairy side of the business. And I'm still very lucky to have my parents, who are both now in their 70s, but they're still living on the farm and still very much want to be involved.
Yeah.
And I think they'll want to be involved as long as they can. So I'm lucky in that sense too. So that does free up some time for me. Otherwise, effectively, one day I'll probably have to have another level of management of people to help to help me to take on with some of the things that others are doing. But like I say, lucky to have Catherine there, really keen and interested, and and got the bug from me. I suppose.
Yeah. We're now going to move on to the part of the show where we talk about bigger questions, more wider industry. But I mean, before the interview, I asked you to give me some of the biggest challenges that you think are in British ag at the moment, and you gave me 2. For the short term, you said the removal of basic payment scheme, subsidies based on land area for any non-farmers who are listening. It is a massive one. It is a massive one. And to be honest, it's probably one of the main things that we're going to be discussing on the podcast over the next year or so. How will that impact your business? And what are you doing now to plan for the transition away from BPS?
Well, I think a number of ways. First of all, like a lot of farms, we've got, for good reasons, we've got quite a lot of farm borrowing. Because there's a proportion of the farm. When I first came back to the farm, we were a tenant. I was the tenant, and then we had the opportunity to buy that farm with me as a sitting tenant. We took that opportunity, but as a result, we have a farm mortgage. So one of the priorities, and that's been in place for quite a few years now. But one of my priorities has been to kind of chip away at that as much as I can, and to get our borrowings to a level that I'm comfortable we can take some hits. Because the main thing about the support we have had, which we've been lucky to have over the last generation really, is it's a buffer to take us through difficult years. And as we also have seen in the last few years with difficult weather, harvests can go pear-shaped, can't they?
Okay.
And the support has been there as a very valued lifeline to kind of even the bumps out in the road. So we all as farmers need to make sure that we can ride those bumps in the future without that cushion of the support. But for us personally, I said the mixed farming is something we feel very passionately about here. And so when we have been able to do some investments, and what we're looking at still investing in has been on the dairy, because we feel that isn't so dependent on support as perhaps other sectors.
Yeah.
So we did a new parlour and collection yard and a fresh cow yard about 6 years ago, and we're just putting in the planning application now for another building as well for the dry cows. So when we are investing, that's what we've invested in. On my gut feeling, I mean, who knows what's going to happen in markets, and at the moment with wheat knocking on £200 a tonne again, we all feel quite confident that it feels pretty good. But we've seen the roller coaster of cereal commodities before, and if it plunged back to 120 or something, it wouldn't be very clever. So our gut feeling here, rightly or wrongly, is that the large scale arable will be tricky. That isn't to say we don't need the benefits of mixed farming I've talked about. We need the straw, and also by having the livestock, we have some better rotation. So it's still going to be there, but it may be more tricky, I think, for large scale arable enterprises. But for us as well, having moved into contract farming, that's a very good way of sharing risk with the clients that we work with. Hopefully we give them a good return and we perform well as contractors. But from our point of view, that is slightly lower risk than perhaps, say, taking on an FBT.
Yeah.
So that's something we've done. And I can see in the future as well, property lets are still going to be there, and I hope we can maybe increase the number of properties that we have to let in the future. My wife's always been very keen to look at whether, because as I said, Wiltshire is quite a tourist trap, and whether in the future we might be able to do some Airbnb with some future, and there may be some other buildings that we can look at whether we do some conversions or something. So that's something we're thinking about. I mean, it's a sidetrack, isn't it? But with the pandemic, I get this gut feeling that we're not going to be able to kind of travel around the world quite as freely as we were, and so all of us are going to be doing more staycations in the UK. But that's definitely an opportunity for farmers to think, how can we can meet that demand? So perhaps it would be a good source of income. Well, it is a good source of income for farming, but it might become increasingly important, because I think we're going to have to all do more holidays in the UK, aren't we?
Yeah. No. And the other challenge you mentioned, which I suppose is sort of linked to what you've just said in some ways, is transitioning to net zero.
Yes.
What are you doing or planning to do on the farm to achieve this?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned before the interview as well how you're planning to do a lot of trees and a lot of hedges. I'd like to kill, probably a bad expression to use, but I'd like to kill two birds with one stone. So we've got the issues of net zero. I'm completely on board with how important that is, but also we've got the biodiversity issue, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Yeah. And we can kill two birds with one stone in a way by doing more planting and I'm thinking more hedges, more trees into our farming systems, because we all know that when there's this slight misconception that if you've got a mature wood, that it's still storing more carbon year by year, but actually a mature wood which reaches a kind of equilibrium, as I understand it. But a new wood, if you put in new trees, so you start with an arable field and you put in a new wood, then obviously that is accumulating carbon on an annual basis. So I would like to do more trees and hedges as a starting point.
Yeah.
And depending on the measure you use, about 8% of our farm at the moment, our cropped area, is used for wildlife habitats, and I can see that increasing quite substantially. We'll see how Elms works out, but maybe that will be up to and maybe 15% of our area. So that for me is an important point. And I said I can talk all night about it. I could talk all night about net zero. I think it's fascinating. I always rather flippantly say, if you wanted me to net zero, I could net zero the whole farm tomorrow, because you shut all the gates and you don't do anything, and it would all rewild itself away. But that isn't going to work, because first of all, I'd bankrupt myself pretty quickly. didn't use the farm to produce crops or for livestock. So that would be the first kind of flaw of that plan. But secondly, obviously, the other issue is that if we just rely on rewilding or planting, then we're just basically offsetting food requirements to other parts of the world. So if other places, i.e. Brazil, have to chop down more rainforest to grow the crops that we were growing and then lug them over in a boat, then we haven't gained anything. And the honest truth is that we're all enthusiastic, or the vast majority of us are enthusiastic about net zero, but none of us really have the answers yet. I've heard the supermarket we work with are very enthusiastic about going down the net zero road, and I understand it. And we all see the benefits of that, but none of us really know quite how to get there yet. And it probably is a bit like the three-legged stool earlier. There's probably a multi-pronged approach. We probably need to be more productive on some of our ground. I think we do need to value our wild areas more. Perhaps we need to have more renewable energy sources on the farm.
Absolutely. I think that's a really key point. It's the small things. I don't often do this, listeners, but just a podcast shout out over on the Nature Friendly Farming Network podcast. At the moment, we are focusing for the latest series on climate and what farmers are doing to try and tackle the climate crisis on their farms. So go and check that out if you're interested in hearing more on that. Where are we going next? I think we're sticking with, so we're going on to wildlife now. So, I mean, obviously the farm keeps you pretty busy, but you do enjoy your wildlife and you do some wildlife photography and some moth trapping as well.
Yes.
Talk me through the moth trapping, because moths are one of those groups that aren't perhaps as talked about as they should be when we think of farm wildlife, perhaps. What do you think?
That's right. So I haven't been doing moth trapping for years and years. It was something I hadn't even really thought or heard of about until about 18 months ago. And I went to see someone on the other side of the county, actually about elm trees, and it was someone who was propagating elm trees.
Okay.
And just as I was leaving, I kind of saw these contraptions in his house. And, well, what's that? He said it was he had a couple of moth traps and talk me through about what it's his hobby and what he did. And I was just a bit kind of taken in by it, really. So for me, I then just looked into it, and the first thing which was fun was I decided I'd involve the children in it. So me and Bertie, my young son, made our first moth trap, which was it's called a Skinner trap, which is basically a box with a light and like a kind of trap in the top that catches moths. And we used that all through last season. And so it's a bit of an odd one, but it's an unusual hobby, I suppose. But for me, we've been setting up in the garden, and there are so many species. I mean, everyone knows about butterflies, and there's approximately, I think, about 50 or 60 species of butterflies in the UK. With moths, there's something like 2,000. And when you start to notice them, they're all through the year. And if you actually start to look when you're driving the car at night, and you look, they're out in the rain, they're out when it's really cold, and you just see them all the time, and you realise how many species there are. And
I was going to say, how is your IDing?
Well, it's getting better. Fortunately, Twitter's a very good resource because there's some absolute experts on there. So there's one account called Moth ID, and if you get flummoxed by one, you can pop a picture to him, and he's just a complete authority. And we'll come back. But they have these fantastic names, and some of the moths, we've just been absolutely blown away with the camouflage and the colours and the designs. I could name hundreds of not hundreds, I'm exaggerating, but I can name some I pick up, like the buff tip moth, which just looks like a twig. It's an extraordinary little thing. It's just completely evolved to look like a twig.
Wow.
There was the first time I had one was a burnished brass, which just looks like it's got this gold tin foil across its back. It just shone at me like a bit of tin foil. And then you've got all the hawk moths, from the elephant hawk moth and the poplar hawk moth and the privet hawk moth, these great big things. And so we've seen those. The other good thing about it is, where it all started with me, actually, it's a shout out to the account, Farmers of the UK account.
Okay.
I'm sure you've done that as well, Ben. And I did it a couple of summers ago at the beginning of harvest.
Yeah. And
that triggered a whole change for me, because I thought, what am I going to talk about this week? And I talked about the beginning of harvest. And then I started thinking about the wildlife on the farm. and realised my ID skills really weren't very good. And I went into a few meadows where there was a lot of butterflies, and I couldn't name them. And I thought, this is actually really embarrassing. And I felt a little bit ashamed, a little bit cross, and it kind of just jumped from that week on that account when I thought, right, I'm gonna learn what I want to talk about the wildlife on my farm. I want to be passionate about it, and I want to know what it is and what I've got here, because I've got a nice farm. I've got these, the chalk down and all these things, and I've not really focused on it before. We'd done a lot of planting hedges, and I'd always been, working with that, but I hadn't been. My passion came in relatively recently, is what I'm really saying.
While I've got you on, I wanted to talk about farmer cluster groups. It's something that I think we've mentioned on the podcast before, but I don't think we've actually ever gone into detail about it. So let's just go back to basics. I wonder if you could just tell listeners who don't know what farmer clusters are,
Sure.
and for any farmers out there or anyone else for that matter who's interested in getting involved, how do they get involved in one?
Okay, so the original farm cluster, I think, in the whole country, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was the Marlborough Downs farm cluster group, which isn't a million miles from me.
Okay. Yeah.
We're not in it, but that was a role model and a benchmark for what potential they have. So effectively, it's a collection. You usually have what's called if I can say it clearly, a facilitator who will kind of run and manage the group, who's usually not a farmer themselves, but an expert in ecology and pharmacology. So the Marlborough Downs was one in our area that basically stimulated an interest in this area for doing some more. So what they're trying to do is to move, have a coordinated effort to move things forward on a landscape scale. So instead of all individual farmers thinking, well, I'm going to do a pond, and someone else says, well, I'm going to plant some elm trees, and someone else says, I'm going to do a flower meadow. Everyone will sit down together, they'll all get their farm maps out, and they say, right, let's look at this. Let's all step back and say, look at this, not just from the individual farm, but look at the whole picture of this whole landscape, Marlborough Downs, or in our case, it's the Vale of Pewsey, and say, how can we coordinate our efforts and do things en masse together for mutual benefit for ourselves, but also for the species that we're trying to target. So that's, I think, the general idea. The benefit for farmers is by using an expert facilitator, it can open up funds that perhaps you wouldn't have had as an individual. Mm-hmm. And for some of the schemes, it's attractive for them to deal with one entity to then distribute across that landscape. But obviously, it's really important. The example I'll jump straight to us. So we're a member. We're on the east side of the Pewsey Downs Farmers Group, and from memory, it's 27 farmers. And one of our targeted species has been the Duke of Burgundy butterfly. So it's one quite close to my heart, and it's probably our most special butterfly species, and arguably our most important species on the farm for its in terms of its endangeredness. And by working for some of those species, you can't do the conservation work on an individual farm. It has to be done over a bigger area, because otherwise the isolated groups of breeding, the kind of numbers become too small in isolated pockets. So if you can get the conservation right over the larger area, it makes the populations more viable. But no, Pewsey Downs has been fantastic. We've got a wonderful facilitator called Simon Smart, who has also been an inspiration to me and a huge help. And we've done all sorts of extraordinary projects, like we've done. We've turned. I mentioned the Kennet and Avon Canal, and all on the Kennet and Avon Canal, which also happens to run through the Vale. We've got these Second World War pillboxes along the length of the canal, and all en masse, we've converted quite a lot of these into bat sanctuaries.
Oh, fantastic.
We've designed them inside to, with all the kind of alcoves and things they need, and adjusted them and put hedges up to them and everything else. So
that's a great idea.
So that's the kind of project that as an individual we would never have thought of, but by working together collectively, we've been able to do things like that.
Super. And just to finish up, if someone is interested in getting involved in a cluster, how do you know how they find out more?
Well, I guess the first thing to do is just ask your neighbours and see if there is an existing cluster in your area. I would thought most circumstances, a farmer would just have been told or should know. How you start them up from scratch, I don't know, but I guess he talked to like-minded neighbours. I would have thought the Nature Farming Friendly Network probably could offer some advice, and I'm sure FWAG could as well, on how to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, you could always send Martin Lyons an email and add to his
probably,
inbox of like 1,500 emails.
I heard he has a few emails a day, so he might get back to you within a couple of weeks. No, I know he's a busy man.
We always finish the Farmers Focus shows with the same two questions. The first one is, if you had a message to the public, any message, what would it be and why?
I bet everyone says the same thing, don't they? But I'm thinking to say, well, thank the public for their support. I think we've seen a lot of support for farming from the public, but ask people where possible and where practical and where they can to buy British produce if they can, if they have a choice, because you are then investing back in your own countryside, investing in businesses in your locality, and they can then invest back in the landscape.
Brilliant. And finally, a message for farmers.
I think it would be taking forward again the idea of clusters. Work together. Don't work against your neighbours. Work with your neighbours. We may have some bumpy roads ahead, but if we actually all collaborate and work with each other and not against each other, then we'll be much stronger for it. I did mention that in for many years I worked closely as a director of a grain cooperative. So I've always been very much clued up with the idea of if you get a lot of farmers and they work collaboratively, you can build great things. And I think the grain cooperative system we have in this country is something again we can be proud of. So I've always believed that farmers should work with each other, share resources, share knowledge, and cooperate as best as they can, and that's to everyone's advantage. Well,
we'll leave it there, but David, thank you so much for coming on. You're a really busy man. You've got loads going on. So I honestly massively appreciate it. You're spending more than an hour
I told you
with me this evening.
I said I could talk the hind legs off a donkey. I probably have done that. But no, it's been an honour and a privilege to let you to say my piece. So thank you, Ben. I much appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And thank you for listening. Next time, we'll be talking branding and how to start food and drinks business. And I'll be joined by Richard Hallwell from Brand Relations. Until then, have a great week and I'll see you next time.